What happens when a late-night talk show host decides to ambush a sitting governor with gotcha questions and personal attacks? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had Governor J.B. Pritzker walking off Jimmy Kimmel's set. After what was supposed to be a friendly political discussion, turned into a character assassination attempt. The tension was palpable from the moment Pritzker sat down, but nobody expected Kimmel to go this far. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story gets wild. The studio lights were blazing as Governor Pritzker walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel live set, waving to the audience with his characteristic smile. He had agreed to this interview to discuss his recent policy initiatives and the upcoming legislative session, expecting the usual mix of light political banter and policy discussion that governors typically get on late-night television. What he didn't know was that Kimmel had spent the afternoon reading opposition research and tabloid rumors, planning what he would later call his most important interview of the year. Kimmel greeted Pritzker with an overly enthusiastic handshake, his grin just a bit too wide. The audience applauded as they settled into their chairs, the governor adjusting his tie and looking relaxed. The first few minutes went smoothly enough, with Kimmel asking about Illinois weather and making jokes about deep dish pizza. Pritzker laughed along, sharing a few anecdotes about his experiences as governor. The audience was engaged, and everything seemed to be going according to the usual late-night formula. But then Kimmel's demeanor shifted. His smile became more predatory, and he leaned forward in his chair like a hunter who had just spotted his prey. The transition was so subtle that most viewers at home probably missed it, but Pritzker noticed immediately there was something different in Kimmel's eyes, a coldness that hadn't been there moments before. Kimmel cleared his throat and shuffled his note cards with deliberate slowness. The audience sensed the change in energy, their chatter dying down to an expectant murmur. Pritzker shifted slightly in his seat, his political instincts telling him that something was about to go sideways. He had been through thousands of interviews in his career, and he could feel when a host was about to take an unexpected turn. Without warning, Kimmel launched into his first attack. His voice took on a mocking tone as he asked about Pritzker's family wealth, suggesting that the governor couldn't possibly understand the struggles of ordinary Illinois residents. The question wasn't just pointed, it was personal, delivered, with a sneer that made it clear this wasn't going to be a policy discussion. Pritzker's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure, giving a measured response about his commitment to public service. Regardless of his background, Kimmel wasn't satisfied with the diplomatic answer. He pressed harder, interrupting Pritzker mid-sentence to make jokes about rich politicians who pretend to care about working families. The audience laughed nervously, unsure whether this was part of the show's planned comedy or something more serious. Pritzker's media training kicked in, and he tried to steer the conversation back to his actual policies, but Kimmel wasn't having it. The host's questions became increasingly aggressive and personal. He brought up old business dealings, family, controversies, and political opponents, talking points as if they were established facts. Each question was designed not to elicit information, but to embarrass and diminish his guest. Pritzker's responses grew shorter and more defensive, his political smile beginning to strain around the edges when Pritzker attempted to explain his position on a particular policy. Kimmel cut him off with a dismissive wave and a joke that drew uncomfortable laughter from the audience. It was becoming clear that this wasn't an interview anymore. It was a roast, and the governor hadn't agreed to be the target. The energy in the studio grew tense as crew members began to exchange worried glances behind the cameras. Kimmel's assault on Pritzker's character intensified as he pulled out what appeared to be a prepared list of accusations. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he read off talking points that sounded like they had been lifted directly from opposition campaign ads. The governor's attempts to respond were met with theatrical eye rolls and dismissive gestures that played to the audience like a comedy routine, except nobody was really laughing anymore. The crew behind the cameras looked increasingly uncomfortable as their host crossed line after line of basic interview decency. The breaking point came when Kimmel decided to bring up Pritzker's family members, who had nothing to do with politics. He made crude jokes about the governor's relatives, their personal lives, and their business ventures, treating private citizens like public punching bags for his entertainment. Pritzker's face flushed red as he leaned forward in his chair, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. He told Kimmel in no uncertain terms that his family was off limits and that this had gone far enough. But Kimmel wasn't backing down. Instead of acknowledging that he had crossed a line, he doubled down with even more vicious personal attacks. He questioned Pritzker's integrity, his intelligence, and his fitness for office in terms that would have been considered inappropriate, even for a political debate. The audience sat in stunned silence as they realized this wasn't comedy anymore. It was something much uglier. Several people in the front rows looked genuinely shocked at what they were witnessing. Pritzker tried one last time to salvage the interview, suggesting they focus on issues that actually mattered to Illinois residents. He spoke passionately about healthcare, education, funding, and economic development, hoping to redirect the conversation towards substance. For a brief moment, it seemed like Kimmel might relent and allow his guest to speak about policy. But instead, the host used Pritzker's earnest response as ammunition for more mockery. Kimmel began imitating Pritzker's speaking style in an exaggerated, condescending manner that would have been offensive coming from a middle school bully, let alone a professional television host. He made faces, changed his voice to a ridiculous caricature, and gestured wildly as he pretended to give his own version of a gubernatorial speech. The performance was so over-the-top and mean-spirited that even some audience members began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The governor's patience finally reached its breaking point when Kimmel started making jokes about Pritzker's physical appearance. The host's comments became increasingly personal and cruel, focusing on aspects of the governor's looks that had nothing to do with his job performance or political positions. These weren't the kind of gentle ribbing that politicians expect from late-night hosts. They were genuinely hurtful personal attacks designed to humiliate rather than entertain. Pritzker's voice became steady and cold as he looked directly into Kimmel's eyes and told him that he had signed up for a political interview, not a character assassination. He pointed out that the host was behaving more like a schoolyard bully than a professional interviewer, and that this kind of behavior reflected poorly on everyone involved. The governor's dignified response only seemed to fuel Kimmel's aggressive behavior, rather than show any remorse or professionalism. Kimmel launched into a rant about how politicians needed to be held accountable and couldn't hide behind their titles. He claimed he was doing important work by exposing what he called Pritzker's true character, as if personal insults and family attacks were legitimate forms of journalism. The irony was lost on him that his own behavior was revealing far more about his character than anything he was saying about his guest. The situation deteriorated further when Kimmel began encouraging the audience to laugh at increasingly inappropriate moments. He would make a particularly cruel comment about Pritzker and then pause expectantly, waiting for applause that was becoming more and more hesitant. Some audience members were clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the show, while others seemed caught up in the mob mentality that Kimmel was deliberately fostering. Pritzker made one final attempt to maintain his dignity and complete the interview professionally. He addressed the audience directly, speaking over Kimmel's interruptions to discuss his actual accomplishments as governor and his plans for the state's future. His words were measured and thoughtful, a stark contrast to the chaos that Kimmel was trying to create. For a moment, the studio fell quiet as people listened to the governor speak with genuine passion about public service, but Kimmel couldn't tolerate being upstaged by actual substance. He began making exaggerated yawning sounds and checking his watch dramatically, as if Pritzker's discussion of important policy issues was boring television. He started shuffling papers loudly and making faces at the camera, doing everything possible to undermine his guest's attempts to communicate with the audience. The disrespect was so blatant that even the most partisan viewers would have found it difficult to defend. The final straw came when Kimmel interrupted Pritzker mid-sentence to announce that they needed to take a commercial break, even though they were clearly in the middle of a live segment. He spoke over the governor dismissively, telling the audience they would be right back after hearing from their sponsors. But instead of going to commercial, he continued his verbal assault, apparently forgetting that cameras were still rolling and the audience was still watching his unprofessional behavior unfold in real time. Pritzker sat in his chair for a moment, processing what had just happened. The studio lights felt harsh and hot, and the audience's energy had shifted from entertainment to something closer to voyeuristic fascination with a train wreck. He could see crew members whispering to each other behind the cameras, their faces reflecting the same discomfort that was spreading throughout the room. This was clearly not how anyone had expected the evening to go. The tension in the studio reached a boiling point as Pritzker slowly stood up from his chair, his movement deliberate and controlled despite the chaos swirling around him. The audience fell completely silent, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented in late-night television history. Kimmel, perhaps finally realizing that his behavior had consequences, tried to laugh off the situation and motion for the governor to sit back down. But his nervous chuckle betrayed his growing awareness that he had pushed too far. Pritzker's voice was steady but firm as he addressed Kimmel directly, telling him that no elected official, regardless of party affiliation, deserved to be treated with such blatant disrespect and unprofessionalism. He explained that he had come to the show in good faith, expecting a legitimate interview about issues that mattered to the people of Illinois, not a personal attack masquerading as entertainment. The governor's words carried the weight of genuine disappointment rather than anger, which made them even more powerful. Kimmel's response revealed just how far he had fallen from basic standards of decency. Instead of acknowledging his inappropriate behavior or offering even a perfunctory apology, he began mocking Pritzker's attempt to maintain dignity in an impossible situation. He made jokes about politicians being thin-skinned and unable to handle real questions, completely missing the irony that his attacks had nothing to do with legitimate political inquiry and everything to do with personal cruelty. The hosts continued. Aggression in the face of Pritzker's measured response exposed the true nature of what had been happening throughout the interview. This wasn't tough journalism or holding power accountable. It was simply a bully with a platform using his position to attack someone who couldn't fight back on equal terms. The audience began to see the dynamic clearly as Kimmel's behavior became increasingly desperate and unhinged. Pritzker calmly began removing his microphone, his actions speaking louder than any words could have. The simple act of unhooking the small device and placing it on his chair sent a clear message that he would not participate in this charade any longer. His movements were unhurried and deliberate, showing that this wasn't an emotional outburst but a principled decision to remove himself from an untenable situation. Kimmel's panic began to show as he realized his guest was actually leaving. He tried to play it off as part of the show, making jokes about sensitive politicians who couldn't handle the heat. But his voice had an edge of desperation as he attempted to convince Pritzker to stay, suddenly switching to a more conciliatory tone that rang completely hollow after everything that had transpired. The damage was done, and everyone in the studio knew it. The governor paused at the edge of the interview area and turned back to face Kimmel one last time. His words were measured and dignified as he explained that public service required thick skin and an ability to handle criticism, but it didn't require subjecting oneself to personal abuse for entertainment value. He noted that the people of Illinois deserved better representation of their state on national television, and that he wouldn't be part of a spectacle that demeaned the office he held. Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation by claiming that politicians needed to be challenged and that Pritzker was proving his point by walking away. But his argument fell flat in the face of the obvious contrast between legitimate, challenging questions and the personal attacks that had dominated the interview. The audience could clearly see the difference, and many were beginning to look embarrassed to be associated with what they had witnessed. As Pritzker began walking toward the exit, Kimmel's behavior became even more erratic. He started talking to the audience as if the governor couldn't hear him, making additional disparaging comments about his departing guest. The pettiness of attacking someone who was no longer able to respond revealed the host's character in the starkest possible terms. Even some of his most loyal audience members looked uncomfortable with this display of poor sportsmanship. The studio fell into an awkward silence as Pritzker disappeared backstage, leaving Kimmel alone with an audience that no longer seemed to be on his side. The host tried to make light of the situation with a few weak jokes, but the energy had completely shifted. What had started as an ambush interview had backfired spectacularly, revealing more about the host's character than his intended targets. The crew scrambled to figure out how to fill the remaining time in what was supposed to be a standard interview segment. Kimmel's attempts to justify his behavior to the audience only made things worse. He rambled about the importance of holding politicians accountable and claimed that Pritzker's departure proved he couldn't handle tough questions, But everyone had seen what actually happened, and it wasn't tough questioning, it was personal. Harassment. The host's explanations sounded increasingly hollow as he tried to rewrite the narrative of what had just unfolded before everyone's eyes. The remaining audience members sat in uncomfortable silence as Kimmel tried to transition to his next segment, but the damage to the show's atmosphere was irreparable. Staff members could be seen whispering urgently to each other in the background, clearly trying to figure out how to handle the unprecedented situation. The professional facade that late-night television depends on had been completely shattered by the host's own actions. In the backstage area, Pritzker was surrounded by his staff and show producers who were apologizing profusely for what had transpired. The governor remained gracious even in the aftermath of his humiliation, thanking the crew members who approached him and making it clear that he understood they weren't responsible for their host's behavior. His continued dignity in the face of such treatment only highlighted the contrast with Kimmel's conduct. The ripple effects of the confrontation were immediately apparent as social media began buzzing with clips and commentary about what viewers had witnessed. The consensus was overwhelmingly critical of Kimmel's behavior, with even his usual supporters struggling to defend what had clearly crossed the line from comedy into cruelty. The host had miscalculated badly, assuming his audience would support any attack on a political figure, regardless of how it was conducted. As the show limped toward its conclusion, Kimmel's closing remarks revealed that he still didn't understand the magnitude of his mistake. He doubled down on his approach, suggesting that more politicians needed to face this kind of scrutiny and that viewers had witnessed real journalism in action. The delusion was staggering, given that everyone had seen exactly what kind of behavior had driven a sitting governor off his set. The final moments of the broadcast showed a host who had fundamentally misunderstood his role and his audience. What was supposed to be entertainment had become an uncomfortable display of personal animus and professional failure. The cameras finally stopped rolling on one of the most disastrous interviews in late-night television history, leaving behind a cautionary tale about what happens when hosts forget the difference between holding power accountable and simply being cruel. That's the story of how Governor J.B. Pritzker walked off Jimmy Kimmel's show after enduring one of the most unprofessional interviews in recent television history. Make sure to subscribe for more stories like this and comment below with your thoughts. Do you think late-night hosts have gone too far in their treatment of political guests, or is this just part of the game? Let me know what you think in the comment section.